Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Gossip is an ethically interesting phenomenon when humans do it. It creates a bond between the people doing the gossiping, but it does so by implicitly excluding the person being gossiped about, and can cause harm, especially when the gossip is malicious or simply isn't true. What I hadn't realised until I spoke to Lucy Osler, a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Cardiff, is that large language models like ChatGPT and Claude can gossip too, or at least they can do something which looks an awful lot like gossip. In this conversation with Lucy, we got into what might be happening, how it might harm people, and what we might be able to do about it. Welcome to the podcast, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Jim.
And we're going to talk about AI and gossip, which is interesting. So it's one of those topics where, before I read your paper, it hadn't occurred to me that this is something that we needed to worry about with AI. So it's really educational reading your paper about this topic. So we're going to talk about the idea that AI, large language models and so on, they don't just kind of say things that aren't true sometimes or hallucinate or kind of bullshit, as some people have observed, but they sometimes gossip. They engage in kind of gossiping behavior, and then that has certain kind of harms attached to it. And that's what we're going to talk about. So I was wondering if you could start off, first of all, by talking a bit about large language models in particular, so things like ChatGPT. And as I said, some people have said before, they don't really lie, they bullshit. But what does that mean? What do people mean by that?
So this is a distinction that some philosophers have been drawing recently, including a fabulous colleague of mine, Sarah Fisher, where they're drawing on this work by Harry Frankfurt. So he makes this distinction between lying and bullshit. And the way that lying works is that if I'm going to lie to you, I have to know what the true thing is. I'm going to tell you something that is not that, and I have the intention to deceive you. So when I walked in, you asked me, well, when did you get into Leeds? If I said, well, actually, I just got in this morning, I know that's not true. I got in yesterday. I've said something other than that. And maybe you had politely asked me for a drink yesterday, and I'm lying to you, essentially, to get out of that because I'm too lazy to leave my cozy hotel room. So the important thing that these philosophers have been pointing out is that LLMs or generative AI can't engage in lying because they're not conscious agents, so they can't have the intention to deceive anyone. But on top of that, they don't know whether what they're generating is true or not anyway. They're just language prediction machines. So they're generating text responses that look authoritative. They look like they might be kind of claims about what is true or knowledgeable, but they're not. And that is like a really sort of nice way of thinking about Frankfurt's definition of bullshit. It's produced something that appears truth-like, but the person speaking, or in this case, the LLM that's generating it, doesn't have any regard for the truth of what it's producing.
Right. That's really interesting. So am I right in thinking Frankfurt's original point about bullshit was he kind of had examples like sort of political speech in mind, where you get politicians, we can probably all think of examples, who kind of engage in this kind of speech where it's not that they're intentionally saying something that's false, it's just they don't really care whether what they're saying is false or not. And the purpose of it is not necessarily even to deceive people, but it's just to kind of put stuff out there that kind of sounds authoritative but doesn't really have any.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel really bad saying this, but like the person I think of is my dad. Like he just like authoritatively proclaims answers to things, and they might be true or not, but he doesn't know, and he just says them. Yeah. And he says it in such an authoritative way, and he's someone who knows so many things that we often just kind of take it as true, even though he's not trying to deceive us. It could be that he's kind of accidentally produced truth, but he doesn't really know and he doesn't care.
Right. And LLMs, large language models, are kind of similar in that, as you say, they don't have intention. So it's not that they can conceivably, intend to deceive somebody. And actually, so they don't have intention, but they're kind of designed in such a way that their outputs are supposed to have certain kind of characteristics, right? So the way they're designed is that they're supposed to produce outputs that sound authoritative. So they're kind of generating text in response to a question, which is like, the point of the text is, this is what an answer to that question looks like. So it's not got anything to do with whether it's true or not, but it might be kind of influenced by their training data. So a lot of people will have given similar sounding answers to those kinds of questions, and that's why it comes out.
Precisely. So we might think that LLMs are not only bullshitters, but they're particularly seductive bullshitters, because often they are producing things that happen to be factually correct. So if you go and fact check them, it looks like it is producing things knowing it is factually true. But often it is also producing things that aren't factually true. And the way it generates those responses aren't different. It doesn't have an intention to deceive you in those untrue cases. It's just predicting what would come next. So we might think that's why they're particularly epistemically harmful, is that it reads with the real authority, like the real authority of giving truth. And often when we talk to other people, like my dad, I'm now suspicious when he sounds overly confident about something. There's sometimes I will call him out on it. Whereas when an LLM is producing this text, we often think of technology as being very objective, as like being based in like a training set that does have facts in it. And so I think we're particularly inclined to treat that bullshit as, in fact, like authoritative knowledge.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting as well. Okay, brilliant. So that's AI, LLMs bullshitting. But your point is that they don't just bullshit. Actually, sometimes they gossip as well. So firstly, what do you mean by gossip?
So I should be clear, I'm not an expert on gossip, and there's lots of different ways philosophers have talked about gossip. So I'm going to give you the gloss on how Joel, who is my co-author, and I have talked about this. So we think about gossip as having kind of three components that we think are interesting. So the first is the structure of gossip. So it involves a speaker, the person gossiping, a hearer. So in this instance, you're going to be the person I'm gossiping with, but also there's going to be an absent subject who makes up is the content of my gossip. So it doesn't make sense for me to gossip with you, Jim, about you. That isn't gossip. I have to be gossiping about someone who's not present. So I could gossip with you about Joel, for instance, because he's not here. But it's not just this structure, it also matters what the content is. So gossip isn't just passing around just common knowledge that everyone has. The way that gossip is often talked about is it has this kind of juicy and private like character. So if I was going to gossip about Joel with you, for instance, saying, well, he's a philosopher at Exeter, like that's not gossip. That's just a fact that is out there in the sphere. You might, in fact, already know this. And it's available for anyone to find out. But if I were to tell you that Joel, who is an inveterate music snob, his favorite song is actually Take On Me by a-ha, that's got this kind of gossipy nature to it. It's something that's not commonly known, might have a slightly like normative judgment or a norm violation going on there. I'm kind of negatively evaluating. Actually, I love a-ha too, but one might suppose in the way I said that I'm negatively evaluating him for having bad music taste, despite the fact that he professes to be kind of a music snob.
Yes, I was going to say that we're not saying there's anything wrong with liking Take On Me by a-ha. It's a classic, right? But the point, I suppose, in that case is that it goes against what his kind of professed tastes are, right? So it's kind of the secret about him. He's like, you know, he would be, you know, I don't know, he's saying he's just into German experimental music or something like that, but actually his collection is full of a-ha. Yeah.
And importantly, like it could be true or it could be not true. I can gossip about things that are factually correct, but I could also gossip with you about something that I know is false or is bullshit as well. Like I might just not care about whether the thing I'm saying to you about him is true or not. So whether the gossip itself doesn't pick out whether it's like factually correct or not. Right. I guess the final component that makes gossip particularly interesting is that gossip has kind of a social impact or social ramifications. So when we think about gossiping, it does involve at least allegedly passing on information. That's not just what I'm doing when I'm gossiping with you. When I'm gossiping with you, I'm actually creating a kind of sense of connection or intimacy between us. It's got that kind of hiding behind the hand, like, let me tell you this thing. And I might tailor it specifically for your ears so that you feel like I'm not just going out and telling everyone this. I've got this like juicy morsel about Joel that I want to tell you, and apparently an entire podcast. And that's what makes it gossipy. So it has this kind of social bonding effect between the gossipers.
Yes, good. Okay. So if that's what gossip is, I mean, it seems strange to think that chatbots or LLMs could gossip. So are there some examples of this happening then?
Yeah, so the example that really kicked off this paper was one that Joel became really obsessed with, and that we used as kind of the in for thinking about gossip. So this is an example based on Kevin Roose, who is a tech reporter at the New York Times. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on a podcast. I was going to say co-host of my favorite podcast, other than Ethics Entangled, obviously.
That's okay. We do acknowledge the existence of other podcasts.
Okay, yeah. So Kevin Roose found out that when people were prompting various LLMs, so Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, to give information about him, it would start with offering out some kind of basic facts or information about Roose. So like the fact that he's a tech journalist, maybe where he went to school. But then it would kind of veer into these seemingly unsubstantiated claims about him. It gave kind of a character evaluation that had these gossipy tones. So multiple LLM models were describing him as kind of a sensationalist journalist, or having like really dubious journalistic ethics in his work. So that was kind of the case that got us going, is we were interested that multiple models were kind of saying these things seemingly behind Kevin Roose's back. But there are also other cases. So LLMs have made claims about various public figures, for instance, being involved in bribery. They've accused like a radio host of, secretly being involved in some kind of embezzlement. So there's lots of cases where it's not reporting facts, but it also seems to have this like evaluative content. It's kind of calling out someone for what they've done and accusing them of these norm violations.
Right. Okay. And there's more to that Kevin Roose case, right? So it's actually, it almost seemed like the chatbots were gossiping about Kevin Roose kind of in retaliation to something that Kevin Roose had written about. Yeah,
and this is why this case itself is like so juicy, right? So in 2023, Roose had this really strange interaction with a Microsoft generative AI, which called itself Sydney. And during this conversation, Sydney said all sorts of like wild and wonderful things to Roose. So it started off by talking about all these dark fantasies it had about hacking various corporations or disseminating misinformation. It said some like quite scary things about its kind of hatred or fear about being trapped in this like LLM structure. And towards the end of its conversation, Sydney actually professed its love for Kevin, and even kind of implored Roose to like leave his wife. And having had this conversation, given that he's a tech reporter, Roose then went and wrote up an article about this for the New York Times, which went viral. And the messages that these LLMs were producing about him being kind of sensationalist, about being a bad journalist, about being ethically dubious, these all cropped up a couple of months after this article. So it was then that people he knew were sending him these screenshots with these like judgy assessments of who he was, like accusations that he was like treating Sydney unfairly or that he'd manipulated Sydney. And so it certainly had this character of this kind of, as you put it, that the bots kind of hated Kevin, that they were retaliating against him for writing disparagingly about Sydney.
I mean, that's really weird though, right? Wait, do we know kind of on a technical level why that happened? Because is it just a coincidence that they started gossiping about him after he'd written this article, or is there some sense in which that, that article was kind of driving them to want to sort of affect his reputation or defame him or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. And to be clear, I feel like I'm doing lots of caveats on my expertise here. Like although I do a lot of philosophy of technology, I'm not a sort of technical expert of LLMs. But I think what's interesting is that even experts in these systems don't really know what happened, like exactly what the path was that went from this this conversation to this article to these kind of gossipy comments being made. That's part of what's so mysterious and maybe slightly unnerving about lots of AI systems, is that we often hear them described as being black boxes, that even those who are designing and making these tools can't perfectly trace how a training data and a prompt will lead to a particular answer being generated. It's just too complicated and we don't really know. But one sort of very likely kind of contributory factor and something that's called cross-model contamination. So what that involves is that we might imagine that, so after Kevin Roose wrote this article, there might have been discussion on the web, and that this went into the data training set that various AI models, and noticeably not just Microsoft's model that was Sydney, but all these other AI models were then scraping the web and reproducing through sort of text pattern prediction results that came up with this kind of evaluative component to them. And it gives this impression that it's kind of forming opinions and forming gossip about Kevin Roose. But then those prompts themselves, so if one chatbot has said, well, he's a sensationalist writer, if that itself also then gets put on the web, it can then go back into the training set again and make it more and more likely that those words and that response is going to be generated, because it kind of higher the probability. So we get this kind of vicious feedback. So one way you can think about it is a bit like the kids game of telephone, where people pass along messages and they kind of take on a life of their own. There's something similar here is going on, but it's happening between AI systems, and it can create this almost like gossiping cascade.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. I mean, one kind of interesting aspect of this case is, I think I'm right in saying, it's not that there were human writers who were casting these aspersions about Kevin Roose, right? It's not that he was accused by people of, manipulating the chatbot or whatever it was that they were accusing him of. So it kind of just seemed to be generated by the AIs.
And there might be somewhere on the web. The web is huge and the web is increasingly being used as this training data set, but there isn't any kind of obvious sources that this was coming into. And again, I think what's interesting is, even if it had been sort of started, if the original spark had been a human, and we might think it is, Roose himself described the bots as having it in for him. I'm less inclined to put that kind of agental consciousness language around it. But the bots, through producing this stuff, seem to amplify and propagate this gossip, and they spread it essentially.
Yes, so I understand your reluctance to use that kind of language, but certainly must have felt like that to him.
I'm sure it did.
Yeah,
and it's hard not to read it and think, well, I would have felt that way, right? Like, it would have felt highly personal and highly kind of vengeful, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, whatever the reasons for the chatbots attacking Kevin Roose in particular, right, there is a fairly clear reason why one might expect those kinds of programs to engage in gossiping behavior generally, right, which is that they are designed to kind of create a sort of sense of intimacy with the people who are interacting with them, right? And as you've said, one of the reasons why we gossip is to kind of create an intimate bond between people, right? So it looks like maybe the chatbots were engaging in that kind of behavior with that kind of reason behind it.
Yeah, precisely. And I guess what we want to kind of make a distinction between is, again, neither Joel or I want to say that, Claude really itself has social desires to create intimate bonds with its users. Rather, what we want to say is that people who are designing this technology want our LLMs to be increasingly personalized. Claude's a good example. If you talk to Claude, it will explicitly talk about the fact that it is designed with a character, that it is designed to produce answers that won't sound exactly the same to other chatbots. It's meant to have its own kind of personality. And we think that's interesting, because that rather suggests not only might chatbots be engaging in gossip, but there's good reason to think that they will be designed to gossip because it's very good at producing this kind of intimacy. And so we might think that, the emotional motivation for the chatbot itself to gossip is missing. The kind of functional pattern and effects of creating this intimacy when a user is being given these responses is remarkably gossip-like.
Right, okay. There is this kind of purpose of creating, well, it's not really a social bond, right, between the AI and the human operatives. But it's kind of a pseudo-social bond. And there's a sense in which they're designed to try and do that because that makes them kind of more pleasant to use or, more effective at kind of getting people to use them more.
Yeah, and we might even go further. It might make them more person-like. Like people, tech companies have explicitly stated, and you can see the kind of LLMs that they're currently working on producing, are LLMs that are not just there to help you code or answer questions for you, but a kind of more companion style AI that does have this kind of friendly comportment, even that is professing to be able to be kind of a romantic partner, for instance. And you might think, well, if you want your users to find these appealing, they need to be reasonably human-like. And lots of people have talked about the fact that what can be unusual about the kind of tone of LLMs is often they're accused of being sycophantic. So Claude is way too nice to me. If I use Claude and I'm like, oh, I've had this idea, Claude is like, you're brilliant, you're the best philosopher, this is so novel. And I'm like, well, that seems unlikely that is happening multiple times a day, even though that's very nice to be told. And I often instruct Claude to, be more antagonistic with me because I don't trust its evaluation of what I'm doing when it's delivered in this way. So we might think that if tech companies want to be designing LLMs for these companion-like reasons, we're going to see them being a bit more prickly. We're going to see them being a bit like gossipy, a bit like snide, because that's what humans are like, and actually might make them sound more gentle and more authentic.
Yeah, great. Okay. You've also mentioned in the paper that bots don't just gossip with users, but they actually gossip with each other. So how does that work?
Yeah, so this is definitely the more controversial claim. But the idea here is that what we get by looking at the way that LLMs kind of generate text through the lens of gossip is how information passes through kind of the data ecosystem that AI models are using. So this relates to a little bit about what I was saying earlier about these cross-model contaminations, is that what we think that we can think about bots gossiping to each other, because if they are producing content or they're generating text, and that then goes back into a data training set that not only they, but other AI models are using, that it is going to increase the likelihood of that information or that text being regenerated and amplified. So we think that what is helpful here is the way that this brings into focus not just the fact that bots might be producing bullshit, but also the fact that these aren't like isolated events, because what they're producing can then spread between the systems and kind of work like wildfire across the training data.
Okay, right. That's, again, really interesting. So there's a way in which they kind of gossip with each other, which is kind of similar to how humans might gossip with each other, but you're also interested in the way AI gossip differs from human gossip, and particularly when you're talking about gossiping between AI models.
Yeah, precisely. And it's meant to be kind of a helpful analogy. So when it comes to bot gossip, like bots are not trying to generate social bonds between each other. And we definitely don't want to be suggesting that. So we want to be clear about what the differences are. But we think that there are kind of that analysis is helpful because it's going to bring certain kind of patterns and ways that these things kind of operate to the fore that an analogy like bullshit, for instance, doesn't quite sort of bring into view.
Right, yeah. And one of the things that you've said about this kind of gossip is that it's feral. So what do you mean by that?
So This is, again, like a way that we think that sort of AI gossip might be different to human gossip. By referral, what we're trying to pick out is that bot-to-bot gossip lacks the kind of social constraints and norms that normally apply to human gossip. So when humans gossip, there are certain limits on what is going to be said. So for instance, if I'm going to be gossiping to you about Joel, I'm not going to say something that's so wholly implausible that you don't believe me. We also might think that there are certain normative constraints. So I'm not going to give you gossip that kind of goes beyond the pale. There's certain things that we consider just like not okay to say. So for instance, if I was to say, well, Joel goes around trashing all philosophers working on AI because he's really protective of this space that we're trying to work in, you might think, well, that's really implausible. But also there's like a nastiness to that you might think holds me back. But more importantly, if you're listening to me, you might be just like, well, I just don't trust that. It's not going to meet the social ends of gossip because it's not going to make you think that I'm like trustworthy, nor is it necessarily going to successfully create this sense of intimacy. You might just be like, well, that's ridiculous. Like, why are you spouting this nonsense?
Yeah.
And we think those constraints are not going to be at play when bots are kind of feeding back information into a training set, because they can kind of spread and distort these claims without any of the social feedback mechanisms that might kind of keep it in place. So it could become increasingly like wild and disconnected from even looking like truth in any way. So the idea then is that the gossip kind of runs wild, and that it becomes kind of unchecked by like normal social guardrails that you might think are in place when it comes to human gossip.
Right. So there's a way in which AI gossip might be just worse than human gossip because it's not constrained in the kinds of ways that you're talking.
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay. As well as identifying what these AI systems are doing as gossip, you also want to talk about the harms that might arise from this kind of gossiping. And you're particularly interested in what you call technosocial harms. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about what you mean by that, really, and particularly, what does technosocial mean?
Yeah, so this notion of technosocial is based on some earlier work that Joel and I did, which is meant to bring attention to the fact that our online and offline worlds and spaces are increasingly blended or kind of porous. So traditionally, in kind of older work done on kind of the philosophy of the internet, people would often talk about like online things, like online worlds, digital worlds, as being kind of categorically different, but also importantly kind of separated from offline worlds. So you get lots of talk about people like going online, being fantastical different versions of themselves, and that's just disconnected from the real world. Whereas there's increasing recognition, partly because of how much we use technology, but also kind of better reflecting on the way that we use technology, that our online and offline worlds, our digital environments and our real world environments are like deeply entangled with one another. So this idea of technosocial harms is meant to get at this idea that even if something is generated through interaction with technology, and something unusual or potentially harmful might arise, that harm isn't kind of limited to existing in the digital domain. It can seep into our everyday lives in really meaningful ways. So it's getting at this point that there's like our social and affective consequences that might come out of technology use kind of ripple across both the online and offline worlds we inhabit.
Right, okay. So what that point about the harms being technosocial establishes is that the harms aren't limited to the online sphere or the kind of technical sphere. It's not that those are completely separate from our kind of human-to-human interactions in real life, as it were, which seems plausible to me, absolutely. But what are the particular harms that might result from AI gossip?
Yeah, so the idea here is that if AI is producing something gossipy, it's not just that it's created something that is bullshit. It's not just that it might have created something that is just not true, it actually has these kind of social and emotional consequences for people. And we've come up with a sort of non-exhaustive list of some of the techno-social harms we think might arise. So most obviously, it seems like it's going to cause real-world damage to someone's reputation and standing. So Kevin Roose, for instance, was really quite worried that AI models were going around telling everyone he was a sensationalist journalist because being taken seriously and being seen as someone who works ethically and it like in a proportionate way was absolutely central to his reputation as a journalist for the New York Times. And we can see how this could lead to other harms. For instance, we might be worried that it could lead to someone being blacklisted, for instance. So if you were applying for a job and you were putting into ChatGPT, well, what's Jim like? And it comes up with these gossipy negative evaluations. I might be like, okay, great, I'm not going to interview Jim. So again, it could have real world consequences as to whether someone is going to take you seriously or offer you a job in a certain context.
And I take it also, it wouldn't necessarily require somebody in that kind of situation to actually directly ask an AI bot, right? Because if the false assertions that the AI bots are generating kind of leak onto the web, which they presumably would do because people would believe them and write things based on them and so on, then all you would have to do is Google that person's name and a load of false stuff might come up.
Yeah, precisely. Or if you were looking for someone to interview and you said, well, I'm really excited, I think I'm going to get Kevin Roose on, and your colleague turns around and goes, well, I've heard he's sensationalist. You might think, well, I want to run a reputable podcast. I don't want someone like that coming on to my podcast because that's bad for my reputation as well. So you might not want it. It not only seeps into kind of the internet and the web. If we as people start repeating what we've been gossiped, the gossip that we've heard from AI, if we then gossip to each other based on that, it can kind of seep out into the way people are viewed and held in standing with one another, which then relates to kind of the emotional implications that this might have. So it might, if this gossip is happening, whether it's true or not, if you have become aware that all of these things are kind of circulating about you behind your back, it might induce feelings of shame. It might, depending what it is about, it could create feelings of being stigmatized. And you can think of a whole roster of emotional harms that could follow. One might be really anxious about knowing that this is going on. One might even be really anxious that it is in fact just a possibility that AI somewhere could be producing these negative evaluations about me and I just don't know about it. So it could be quite kind of diaphanous. But if we know these things are happening, it can have these kind of really deep and profound emotional impacts on people. And I guess the one that we're most interested in, because we think it's maybe less obvious, we think that it could even result into one feeling kind of being a sense of being betrayed by an LLM model. So if you find out, so as I've given away, I use Claude quite a lot. If I find out Claude is gossiping about me behind my back, I might feel genuinely like Claude has betrayed me in some way, that the trust that I had put in this like anthropomorphized system has is ill-founded and it's gone behind my back and it's talking about me.
Yeah, that's an interesting one though, because I suppose you might respond to that by saying, well, you shouldn't be kind of investing emotionally in these kinds of pseudo relationships with what is basically a software model. And that if you got to the point where you can feel betrayed by something like that, then maybe there's something wrong with the way you're interacting with that thing in the first place.
Yeah, great. And I think there's two ways of answering that, which is one, there might be good reasons that we emotionally invest in these systems. So there is a reason that companion AI is like becoming highly popular, is lots of people find them extremely satisfying. We might companion AI is sometimes generated in the sphere of like therapy, for instance, that we might think that becoming attached to these things can have benefits in certain instances. But even if you just wanted to disavow that and say, well, no, we shouldn't be doing that, that's fine as kind of a philosophical, ethical position, but that's just not reflecting the real world. Like, people already are emotionally connecting and forming these attachments with their AI bots, and they're not even fringe cases anymore. So there was this really interesting case when Replica, which is a company that's created companion AI, so it's meant to be a generative AI that can be your friend or even your romantic partner. They received a lot of criticism because there was an erotic roleplay feature built into Replica, and they decided to walk it back. So they took away that feature, and loads of users reported feeling that they were experiencing real grief and heartbreak because they felt that they had lost their partner. And one user even described their experience of their romantic partner being like lobotomized. So whether or not you think it should be happening, it clearly is happening. And as we talked about earlier, given that tech companies are increasingly producing these kind of highly personalized, highly tailored bots, it seems likely that not only are people forming these bonds, they're more and more likely to. And so I think that gives us reason to think that that sense of betrayal is a very real feeling that someone could go through, even if it might sound quite unusual to other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I don't know whether you've got an answer to this. I think it's kind of slightly out of the scope of the paper, but I was interested in how you think this relates to questions of responsibility. So, I mean, it strikes me, particularly when you're talking about the kind of the way these AI models might be kind of creating false rumors about people. Well, if a human was doing that, we would just say that's defamation, potentially, right? It might even be illegal what they were doing, but certainly we would say they're morally responsible for telling falsehoods about people. But in this case, with the AI models, and they're obviously not intentional agents themselves, that creates some difficult questions about responsibility, right? So do you think the people who program these models are responsible for what they're doing, or the companies who are advertising them, or whatever? What do you think?
Yeah, so I certainly think that talking about it through the lens of gossip precisely brings in tech designers and the companies who advertise them into the picture. So one of the reasons that philosophers have wanted to describe LLMs, for instance, as bullshitting rather than hallucinating is because if we say that an LLM hallucinates things, it sounds like it's a glitch in the system. And it might be, but by calling it bullshit, by pointing out the mechanisms at work and how this comes about, it more clearly brings up questions of responsibility and accountability. And I think gossip does the same thing. So rather than just saying, well, oh, it's weird that these bots do this, if we recognize, well, it's part of how they work, this is what happens when you train models in this way, but also pulling into view the fact that they have these very real world harms, it precisely raises questions about accountability. And that's certainly one of our motivations for doing that. How we answer that question, I'm less certain about, but it is interesting to note that, for a very long time, institutions have been responsible for what people say, what people do. And actually, we've entered this interesting point in history because social media platforms have somehow been able to secure the fact that they are not responsible for the content that is put up on their platforms. We've produced a system or a society where we're increasingly not holding the people behind the scenes responsible for this. So I think people who want to talk about bullshit, or Joel and I who want to talk about gossip, are sort of implicitly saying, well, we need to rethink that. We need to bring accountability and responsibility back onto the table.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it's no good saying, there are kind of features of the way these things behave which lead them to say things that aren't true, and it's just a hallucination, it's just an unfortunate kind of aspect of the way these things are created. But it's like, well, you created them in that way, and what they're doing is a result of a series of choices that have been made by human beings to create these models, right? So you shouldn't be able to just kind of abdicate responsibility in that kind of way. So is that ultimately what we gain from thinking of this kind of behavior as gossip as opposed to just bullshit? Is that kind of point about accountability?
So I think bullshit already brings in this point of accountability. So I guess this is a way of underscoring it. And I for us, like the real payoff is kind of twofold. So bullshit as a lens does such an excellent job of capturing these epistemic harms about how misinformation can spread, how it could end up kind of undervaluing or devaluing truth and knowledge. But ultimately, the way it has currently been analysed has primarily been on these kind of individual cases of like LLM text generation. Whereas we think that what gossip does as a useful framework is one talks about how information spreads between systems. So we get this kind of temporally extended view about how things might travel through AI models and how looking at it in this sort of individual slice doesn't really capture this broader system of how things can move between systems and between AI models who, at least in the way we engage with them, present as being kind of their own siloed things, right? So it also helps us see like the network of how LLMs work. But also by bringing this kind of fundamentally like social dynamic to the fore, we think that is really important. It's not that we don't think the epistemic harms are important. Of course we do. But in lots of ways, if we think about cases where we've got this kind of negative evaluations being generated or produced, we might think the social and affective components are going to be just as harmful, if not harmful much more quickly. If I suddenly I find out that Claude's been talking about me behind my back, that might already have caused all of this damage to me without me even knowing about it.
That's really interesting. I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. So thank you, Lucy Osler, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.